Hello, everybody, and welcome to the last day of the 2022 School for Politics and Critics. We are starting with the lecture of Zachary De Jong, named The Withering Away in Which State? Zachary, when you're ready.
All right, yeah, thanks so much. So I just also want to say, since this is the last official lecture of the school, so thanks to all of the participants who showed up, who gave presentations, who talked. It's nice to have a sort of strong community when we're doing this sort of thing. I'd also like to thank Katarina for hosting this conference, as well as the Institute, and allowing me to speak, which may or may not have been a good decision. Likewise, I'd like to thank Rista for all of the behind the scenes work that he does every single day. I'm sure all of us appreciate it a lot. So with that, I'll begin my talk. So the title of this lecture is The Withering Away of Which State, which draws its direct inspiration from a famous passage by Engels, although the imagery which withering conjures up is not quite entirely correct, as it's not simply a sort of dialectic inevitability that the state, which we'll discuss what that is, will sort of die and then be reborn with new fertile soil. But nonetheless, that's the title I went with. So to begin the discussion on what the state is, we'll start with a very brief etymology, at least for its English version. So the word state itself in English is a term whose political meaning, however nebulous, is entirely taken for granted. It is common to conceive of the state as nothing more than the ruling body and the diverse amount of different governmental bodies therein of a particular territory. That is, the entire structure of governance and control, whether it be through law and force or simply through the force of law itself. Yet the origin of the word, again in English, is very definitive. The word state derives from the Latin word status, which simply means condition or circumstances. In turn, status itself derives from stare, to stand or to be permanent. Thus, at its origins, the state can be seen, at least in an abstract way, as a permanent perpetuation of current circumstances, or, as it were, the reproduction of a particular set of conditions, and thus also the social, political, and economic divisions therein. It is also crucial to note from the outset that the state is always materially determined. That is, that the state cannot simply be divorced from any sort of material conditions. Rather, it is distinctly created, even artificially created. So there's nothing natural about it in the sense that it doesn't come ex nihilo. It's not somehow just born. Here we should oppose, as Katerina Kolosova does, Hegel's abstract notion of the state, which itself relies on a form of abstract subjectivity, whereby the material world is subsumed and picked up into the real world of thought, the in itself, for us. This dematerialization results in an absence of material politics, instead leading us into, such as various Hegelian thinkers that are also supposedly left, such as Axel Honneth, Charles Taylor, Jürgen Habermas, etc., into nothing more than a politics of recognition, a politics that does not at any fundamental level aim at changing the means of production or other key material aspects of the state. Thus, this recognition, if not submitted to material practice, amounts to nothing more than a form of individual voluntarism. This is precisely why Walter Benjamin states that, well, in regards to fascism, that fascism attempts to organize the newly created proletarian masses without affecting the property structure which the masses strive to eliminate. Fascism sees its salvation in giving these masses not their right, but instead a chance to express themselves. The masses have a right to change property relations. Fascism seeks to give them an expression while still preserving property. This is the end of the quote by Benjamin. So for me, one of the important parts of this quote is the phrase "to express themselves." Again, it's not a material shift, but there's a sort of form of recognition, understanding as the sort of populist move that is not in any way unique just to fascism or anything of this sort. Indeed, this is also true in a certain sense of liberal not in the radical or originary sense of liberalism, as well as particular post-structuralist discourses which insist on the primacy of individuation. This is not, of course, in any way whatsoever to say that post-structuralism carries some form of fascist seed or right-wing seed and so on and so forth, but rather that the emphasis of the rights of subjects has moved away from real material change into more abstract and diffuse forms of change. I am also here not rejecting the progress and liberating aspects of much of post-structuralist theory, but rather simply pointing out the danger of the apparent hierarchy within this, the individual over the collective and the abstract and ideal over the material. Indeed, identitarian politics can form their own sort of structure of discrimination, producing and ruling by cultural and social capital, and as such, run the risk of doing away with more broad and universal conceptions of change. It follows rather naturally from this, and we'll again return to this later, that a Marxist critique of the state cannot simply be an abstract critique of an entity, but rather a concrete critique of actually existing material social conditions, which themselves are produced and reproduced within a given state of affairs by a given body and set of bodies. And body can be seen here both as governmental bodies and the physicality of bodies themselves. Yes, thus the title of this talk, which summons Engels' famous dictum, already implies the withering away of a body and a reproductive function, or the bureaucratic management, violent control, and ideological components of a global capitalist society. State in this sense is also then a meta-state, a state above the state which reinforces not simply the rules, but the entire system of ideas of thinking, of production, and so on. However, we should not be so quick to reduce the state to either point as either the ideological mass or the violent and organizing governing body. As Marx has, of course, famously shown, capitalism itself, and thus capitalism as a form of state, or at its lowest possible form, a key component of the state's organizing principle, itself is formed on primitive accumulation, acquired through what we could call legal thievery. Indeed, there is nothing fundamentally, according to the structures which exist, illegal about capitalism itself. Capitalism is the result and generator of its own laws, of its own internal drive for growth, exploitation, and division, which is entirely linked to the state itself. According to Marx, primitive accumulation required an almost arbitrary interference on the part of the state. Arbitrary here not referring to accidental or without purpose, but rather devoid of any true universal reasoning. Or in other words, it was not simply a natural process. Indeed, it is critical to maintain, again, as Kolosova does, to quote, "There is no such thing as a natural or apolitical economy. The economy is always already political, and it is the economy's material core of power, control, and its main mechanisms, i.e., exploitation and oppression." Indeed, Marx himself refers to primitive accumulation as a form of ruthless terrorism, as a complete and utter appropriation, which is, again, an appropriation of material, but done in a way that is not itself materialist. There's two crucial things which we can take from this. in regards to private property. Firstly, the modern conception of private property, and with it, an intensified division of classes, was carried out by the state itself, which is to say the state and capitalism are always already tied together. Now, of course, this is not some sort of radical or novel notion. I mean, even on an everyday basis, we know that capitalism and the state are together, and we even accept it in the normal sense of any sort of state, even a quote unquote more democratic socialist state, whether there's taxes or roads and anything. On the most basic level, it's already there, but also in its most expansive and brutal forms, it's there as well. Secondly, the entire structuring of capital society at its core level is anchored by a form of legal fraudulence, not unlike the concept of state capture, which is this institute has done lots of studies on in relation to illiberalism, again expounded upon by Kolosova and others at the institute, whereby the authoritarian takeover is done perfectly legally and works perfectly because it's done perfectly legally. Crucially, this means that if we're to reimagine or rethink what some sort of post-capitalist or post-statist capitalist society could be like, it is also necessary to look at the sort of legal aspects and the legal exceptionism of the state in order to move past the state, not merely as a body, but also as an ideological apparatus. The state and capitalism are, at this point, nothing more than a pornographic display, a beast with two backs, where everything is constantly exposed, and yet this very exposure appears almost as a mutual cover-up. That things are so evident is actually hiding the fact that they're constantly occurring. Shifting now to the notion of subjectivity and state apparatuses, I would claim that the state and subjectivity are both intrinsically and extrinsically linked. Intrinsically in the dual sense that a subject is, at least partially, interpolated, or to speak more generally, formed by the ideological and non-ideological aspects of the state. Non-ideological referring to the more dominant violent forms, not that they're also not ideological themselves, while also contributing to the formation of a hegemonic function of the state via the willingness of the subjects as such. Now, when I say willingness, I'm not saying we want to be under a certain capitalist order or that we want these things to happen, but rather that there's always some part of complicity, an inevitable part of complicity. And this isn't necessarily some terrible thing. It's just sort of a form of the human condition. So in other words, interpolation is neither a directly one-way function, nor is it determined in a way that exceeds the subjects who are said to be interpolated as such. If we look at it from an extrinsic point of view, and looking as Kojin Karatani points out, the state is self-alienated from itself as a form of global actor, what we could also call a sort of global externality, which grants its internal legitimacy and in turn allows for national subjects, for state subjects, as well as subjects of value, i.e. surplus value in exchange between states, not merely economic exchange, but also all sorts of things like immigration and status based on culture and so on and so on. Now, if you look at Althusser's famous and foundational text on state apparatuses, we immediately observe a clean distinction between the two forms, ideological and repressive. To state it in a somewhat tautological fashion, ideological apparatuses function ideally, that is, according to the reproduction of the eidos of the state itself, and as it were, the state's complicity in the functioning of capitalism. The subject who, to borrow Lacanian language, acts as the detritus of being, as a sort of empty husk who nonetheless has the freedom to revolt, accepts their posturing as naturally internal while nonetheless engaging with these apparatuses themselves. This process would therefore entail the dematerialization of the subject as such, and its retransformation into an ideal structural effect, which is nonetheless nothing more than matter itself. That is, the subject in this sense becomes an ideal ego of the state, and its ego ideal is reciprocally constructed. Repressive apparatuses, however, are direct forms of oppression while violent actions from the state. They are direct material interventions into the bodies of the citizens, the subjects who refuse to be proper subjects. If they do not relinquish their matter, it will be beaten out of them until they bow at the bloody altar of capitalism and state. This is how it functions. They dematerialize you through material force until you're nothing more than an abstract value. Here, it is also crucial to clarify, as Althusser himself does, that ideological state apparatuses do not belong to the state qua legal governing body, but rather are the result of the ruling class, or in his case of the bourgeois or aristocratic classes. The reason this distinct relation is so crucial is because the implication is that any withering away of the state is also automatically the withering away of the ruling class. However, it simultaneously raises the question that if the ruling class were not in fact, ruling class, not in fact the bourgeois, or perhaps more accurately, if class distinctions as such did not exist, then the ideological state apparatuses themselves would inevitably reflect this, i.e., the state as an ideological producer would produce the ideology of something like communism, although this is a rather dubious notion, I think. So if we move into a similar example or a similar analysis of state apparatuses, we can see a function in Alain Badiou. In a similar fashion to Althusser, the state in Badiou is also conceived of as a metastructure. The metastructure of the state does not simply secure presentation. This is Badiou's terminology, which really just means that everything which is present, but actively works to prohibit any form of rupture or event. That is to say, any possible form of radical change. In Badiou's language, the state reduces all possible change to the constructible. That is, what is constructible in a given situation. Everything is always already subsumed into the lexicon of the ruling order, of the lexicon of capital itself. For Badiou, the mode of resistance to this is dependent on subjective intervention. A subject here being the embodiment of a universal exception, or that which exists but is not reducible to the current situation itself. Similarly, for Badiou, a work, in his terms, as opposed to a waste, is an infinite relation that grounds the finite situation itself. Infinities are themselves infinite and function as a hierarchical index of the ascension towards ideals, just communist ideals, universalism. That is, work is defined by the universal overcoming of the particular hegemony of a finite situation in which it seems like there's no way out, a situation which is only capable of producing waste products. A work is incorporated by subjective action. Again, subjective here does not refer to any given individual subject for Badiou, but rather the mass who tries to defy the order as it is, the order which is dominated by the infinite finitism of capitalism, which strangles any possible theory of a way out and tries to force us into a mode of docility and even regression. A work is to be carried out through a careful and structural procedure whereby the truth of the situation, i.e., what exceeds the situation through formal subtraction, so that which can't be presented or is presented but not presentable, is discovered and transmitted. We can say then that what it requires is a certain novel syntax, or what Klozovic calls a syntax of the real. What this means is that we determine the truth of a situation, the radical possibilities of a situation, by adhering to the material conditions themselves, as opposed to beginning with abstract ideas and trying to move forward. This is crucial, as the emphasis is often put simply on thought or simply on action. But if the action is being governed by an idealist mode of thought, a thought governed by a particular form of subjectivism, then there is very little we can actually do to change the material circumstances. Thus, the subjective embodiment of a political work is nothing short of the dismantling of an entire order through the universalization of the means of production. However, we also encounter here, as I was saying before, the issue of the idea as an idealist category. For Badiou, the idea must be resuscitated against its idealist version. That is to say, we cannot reduce ourselves to mere minor changes, but must assert the idea of communism, of absolute and international commonality. This, however, also has its direct opposite side, its right-wing side, because the idea does not simply belong to the left or the right. And we'll explore this more later on. If we return back to the question of state apparatuses, we can see something rather interesting, because if the state is not simply a legality, according to Althusser, then what is a non-state apparatus which serves the same principles of the state itself? That is, the reproductions of the conditions of capitalism and the reproduction of ideology. If we look at the apparent phenomena of manufacturing consent, made famous by Noam Chomsky, we can immediately notice something peculiar that's going on in today's media, something Chomsky himself later admitted. If the media is meant to be part of an ideological state apparatus of reproducing the state, what is under constant attack is in fact mainstream media itself. Then what precisely are those other outlets, those more diffuse outlets such as podcasts, blogs, etc.? They do not belong in any formal sense to any of these spheres. Again, if you return here to the meaning of state as status, we can see that it must extend far beyond the narrow confines of a particular organizational structure, and must be seen primarily as an entire mode of organization itself. This is precisely why Foucault states that we can't defeat the system through isolated actions. We must engage it on all fronts: the university, the prisons, and the domain of psychiatry, one after another, since our forces are not strong enough for simultaneous attack. We strike and knock against the most solid obstacles. The system cracks at another point. We persist. It seems that we're winning, but then the institution is rebuilt. We must start again. It is a long struggle. It is repetitive and seemingly incoherent. But the system it opposes, as well as the power exercised through the system, applies its unity. So here we have simultaneously this idea that there's a whole diverse set of actions that must be taken, that there's not simply one form of action, that this hegemony does not exist purely on a top-down level, but is more sort of spread out and more diverse, but also that fighting the system can lead, and often does lead, to the re-solidification of the state, i.e. the precise opposite of what it's meant to be done. Likewise, with this being said, if we focus too much on disparate and varied modes of modes of resistance, it is easy to lose sight of the more traditional notion of state itself. That is, the state as the securer of the means of production, or at the very least that which allows for and promotes a particular form of unified organization, even if this organization is itself diffuse. This is why we should not be overly tempted by Foucault's anti-hegemonic conceptions, or in other words, his insistence on the absence of a core sort of sole main point of ideology or power. That is, we should not ignore the state and capital and its influence, instead focusing on a series of micro-political and micro-power situations. Even if these must be analyzed in depth and taken very seriously, they must not be entirely separated. Decentering power, rendering it nothing more than a series of interconnected processes, inevitably leads to a form of forgetting of state power, as if such and such power relations existed ex nihilo, without having direct reason. Reason in this sense being the logic internal to the preservation of an idea, as discussed before. In this case, the idea of capital, or even more simply and perhaps more accurately, the idea of value itself. Now, an interesting example of this is that if we look at COVID, so much of the philosophical and theoretical discourse surrounding it had to do with very abstract notions. People were focusing on the diffuse and rhizomic nature of the virus, of its status of being both dead and alive, or undead even. Yet, what the COVID era showed, no matter your opinion on the regulations themselves, was a direct, unequivocal abuse of state power in contradistinction to not only democratic values, but the democratic account itself. Voices were completely quashed, and we were in a permanent state of political and economic exception. The crushing power of the state, of the permanent state of exception imposed upon citizens, which turned them into not only subjects of, but subjects to the state, while also, of course, creating a whole series of micro-politics and diffuse power inequalities, was nonetheless carried out by a form of megastate, a conglomeration of individual states all existing in a permanent state of exception. A prime example of this in the relations between Althusser's classic distinctions between ideological state apparatuses and restrictive state apparatuses can be seen in the violent reaction against peaceful, largely working class protests in Canada, which is where I'm from, hence the example. Not only were the protests deemed to be racist, fascist even, which is a normal discursive ideological move, ignoring the actual material circumstances which existed there, as this was not even remotely the case. Maybe 1 or 2% of the protests themselves consisted of movements such as this. So not only were they deemed this, but Justin Trudeau attempted to employ what in Canada was called the War Measures Act, which he politely referred to instead as the Emergencies Act, which had not been deployed in Canada since the terrorist act of the radical Quebecois group, the FLQ. Likewise, he quite literally froze the assets, or at least tried to freeze the assets, of those who refused to give up. I.e., he went straight into their material working conditions, showing again that the state has complete control and complicity in capitalist structures. Now, why precisely was this particular situation an emergence? What was the emergent dilemma? Now, while it is slightly naive and not perfectly reducible to this, it is the loss of profit. There are, of course, jobs at stake and industries that could fail and other problematics. For instance, in this case, the protests continued to go on. But this was nonetheless an anti-democratic suspension in which the will of the minorities representing the universal majority was immediately and intentionally stifled. Here again, status is critical. They were meant to remain silent, that is, the protesters, to again use Foucaultian language, act as docile bodies, were meant to reproduce a form of capitalist machinery. However, their absence of work, their absence and refusal to work in this manner actually allowed for the dismantling of a part of this capitalist machinery itself, or at the very least, it revealed its fragility and the power of mass movements, regardless of whether you agree with the protesters in this particular scenario. The class divide is something that also cannot be forgotten during this era. It was, if not the crystallization of, then at least the pulling away of the thinly veiled curtain pretending to hide the complicity of capital and state. According to a Financial Times article from 2021, and I quote, as the virus spread, central banks injected $9 trillion into economies worldwide, aiming to keep the world economy afloat. Much of that stimulus had gone into financial markets, and from there into the net worth of the ultra-rich. The US Federal Reserve, for example, had put $8.1 trillion into the economy through quantitative easing, about 1/3 of gross domestic product. The total wealth of billionaires worldwide rose by 5 trillion to 13 trillion in just 12 months, the most dramatic increase ever registered. End of quote. So we see here immediately that the apparent ideology of the state, of the greater good, of the protection of workers and their families, and so on and so forth, is actually completely divorced from the state as a capitalist power. But again, this ideological move is not reducible down to purely economic while monetary oppression. Rather, it is based on a particular form of an idea, on a capitalist idea. This idea, which stands over and above matter, is value, pure value, surplus value, nothing but value, completely divorced from any form of materiality. Another interesting example of how this idea works in its relation to the state can be taken from Alexander Dugin, who is, well, you can call him a fascist, but she is, but also a traditionalist, amongst any things, who tries to promote the larger Russian state, extending even into Bulgaria as part of this large Orthodox unity. As Dugin himself explains, this is far before the Ukraine war for context, in relation to Putin and his political situation. He states, as both the formal and informal pinnacle of the power pyramid, how could anything exist above Putin? Inherent in the very notion of sovereignty is that above him stands no other institution of authority. That is the point. So what exists above Putin, if everything in Russia exists below or beside him? The idea stands above. So here again, we have it. State power is linked fundamentally also by a particular form of idea. An idea which is abstracted and refuses to change, or changes in an idealistic way the conditions of existence. Now, at this point, I want to transition also into an issue concerning this ideality, especially as it relates to possible critiques of post-structuralism. Well, at the very beginning of this talk, I spoke of some of the minor issues within post-structuralism, i.e. a tendency of individuality and voluntarism. A mere critique of this does not lead to anything radical whatsoever, or at least not automatically radical in any real way. Thus, I will take a bit of a lengthy detour through the work of Nick Land to show why simply focusing on materiality away from the idea and away from post-structuralism does not in any way grant any sort of communistic premise. Instead, there are different axioms and different modes that need to be implemented in order to achieve this. For Land, it's very important that we move away from a particular form of thought that states that we can only think in a correlationist manner, or that we can only think things through our own thought, that it's impossible to get to any form of real, of any form of exception, of anything really that is novel. So for instance, for Land, deconstruction reduces negativity to difference, to the structuring of binary terms, while positivity is thus not only the result of negativity, but negativity itself is constituted only in relation to itself, to the positive logical constructions which come into being only through negation. The result for Land is that any radical deployment of negativity is always already neutered. that the only position deconstruction can take is one of indifference. To quote him at length, all uses, references, connotations of the negative are referred back to bilateral opposition as if to an inescapable destination, so that every de, un, dis, or anti is speculatively imprisoned within the mirror space of the concept. If we were to follow deconstruction to the letter here, it would follow that atheism, anti-humanism, and anti-logic, far from being virulent, pestilent swamps, had no force except through their determined relations to their enemies. So basically, when we're trying to negate something, we're saying we're not doing this, we're anti this, we simply reintroduce the other term and still remain trapped within this ideological relation. Thus, Land here is distinctly critiquing the entire structure of not only deconstruction, but essentially post-structuralist discourse, not simply as an epistemological mode of understanding, but as a force of potential change, including, of course, political change. So the automatic reduction to the other term, the correlated term, is meant to be negated as nothing more than its inevitable pairings. There's no way to escape it, and again, we're trapped in the same situation. In the same way that dialectical logic is forced into a relation of relationality, whereby the negativity inherent in the concept is sublated according to the contradictions present, and thus into a present horizon of knowing, deconstruction remains trapped in the mirror space of the concept, or in other words, its power is stripped away due to its own tautological structure. Thus, we can also state that this postmodern conception of deconstruction not only does not single a radical critique of how things are, but does not transcend a particular philosophy of presence which it thought historically so hard to bury. Indeed, if presence is thought of as describing a certain level of being, a certain being to be being there, the deconstruction in this sense merely states that this is ought to exist as a confinement without offering any possible way out. However, if we move past this critique, we can see that the way Land exceeds this is in fact through a completely nihilistic and accelerationist mode, whereby capitalism should in fact be accelerated and human beings themselves are treated as essentially worthless. He rejects any sort of human uniqueness, which in a certain sense is good, as it allows us to move away from anthropocentric thought. But while doing so, he also ends up achieving, well, intentionally so, the precise opposite of what a leftist politics would be meant to be about, himself constantly flirting with different fascists and neo-nationalist tendencies. So again, if we're going to critique something of this nature, whether it's post-structuralism, the idea, materialism, human-centered thinking, it is not ever simply enough to remain in the realm of negation. We have to move towards more positive formulations. But again, here it is important to emphasize, as he does do correctly, the only thing he does correctly, that value itself is a self-perpetuating and plastic notion. That his obsession with machines as being exceptional or better than humans is also entirely linked to his idea of value. It's also interesting in Land, as he shows that the opposite of idealism is not materialism necessarily, but what he calls, following Deleuze and Guattari, virtual materialism, a materialism that does away with anything physical or material, and yet does not rely on classical idealist notions. Okay, there's much more in this section, but this is too abstract and not very political. So we'll move away from this. The point then, of course, arises, well, 2 points immediately arise. One is, if this is the case, what are particular forms of resistance? What is possible of resistance? And what kind of positive affirmations can we have? One of the interesting things we can see if we're trying to look at particular modes of resistance are protests, which of course can be right or left wing. Protests themselves inherently display a form of unity, a form of collective action against the state's attempt to make everyone into isolated individuals. Yet protests themselves have the possibility, such as Jody Dean points out about the Occupy Wall Street movements, to actually divide people therein precisely due to the lack of a positive statement. Thus, while being able to incorporate people from all sorts of different backgrounds and ideas, there is nothing truly uniting everyone, or that unity ends up being immediately abstracted into something else. This is the same thing that occurs in larger political movements, say during the Arab Spring, where the slogans were, you know, kill Gaddafi, kill Mubarak, essentially. But it wasn't create a new state or change the means and modes of production. This was never the slogans. Instead, it was purely and entirely negative. So how do we move past this sort of notion? I think from a very pragmatic stance, the left, in relation to the state and oppression and organization, needs to simplify everything. There are certain axioms that we can agree on that should be the sort of core of what we're doing. So for instance, something that cuts across or should cut across all leftist notions is the idea that we should do away with exploitation of workers. Now, we should also extend this not simply to workers or human beings, but to beings themselves. And in that, I'd include not simply animals, but also plants, oceans, and everything like this. This should be something that's easily agreeable on and also easily transferred and communicated. We're often stuck, such as my insane abstract paragraphs a while ago, in these very strange notions of what leftism is. But there's also concrete things that we all sort of understand inherently, such as this, and that need to be simplified and transferred. If you can't go to a factory and go on a rambling rant about Hegel and sublation and expect something to happen. So yeah, there has to be a real concreteness to it. So one of the core things is precisely this, the end of exploitation. The second, although this is not universal across all leftist things, although it should be, is precisely the main topic of this talk, which is anti-statism, which with it is also referring to anti-nationalism and anti-hierarchy, hierarchy in the sense of just ordinary discrimination. So I think from this aspect, it's best to, simplify things really in a certain sense. And of course, there's other things like, international cooperation, the end of all wars, and so on. But I don't want to drift too far into purely utopian topics, but rather, again, focus on concrete things that can be done. The issue that also arises is that many of these concrete things, or what would appear to be immediately productive concrete things, such as, let's say, mass unionization, have large flaws in them. If you look at the auto industry in Brazil in the late 80s, they very successfully and through sort of traditional leftist tactics were able to disrupt the entire system of production, thus allowing for the creation of incredibly strong unions. However, what David Harvey calls a capitalist fix, whereby capital moves from a country or area of high regulation back to low regulation in order to reproduce itself, almost necessarily occurs according to the logic of capital itself, which is precisely what happened in Brazil. The same thing happened in the United States in Detroit, which has used to have some of the strongest unions in the world, and even has murals by Diego Rivera inside. And yet they are now incredibly poor and have incredibly low levels of unionization. Now, this is not to say that we should be discouraged in some sense, rather that when we're doing things of this nature, that we have to realize the globalness of it. It's not simply enough to change it in one particular area. There's an expression that you should think local and act global, but I think it's almost the precise opposite. You should act global and think local, i.e. think in your given material circumstances, in your own community, in your own lives, and then from that, act globally, act so that what you're doing is global. Instead of just saying, I'm going to go to the market, or I'm going to do this, instead of, no, it has to be automatically not only applicable, but motivated towards. That doesn't mean that you should not care about the local actions, but precisely the opposite. Do them as though they were universal and global. So where was I now? So yes, so the point really in all of this is to state that if we're doing away with the state, which we're always already in, we must do away with the material factors, i.e. the modes of production and the means of production. We must try to take them back, or at least modify our relation to them. So it's not simply discursive. And yet at the same time, we must battle discursive battles, which is another key thing. We always want to separate everything out. There's the material struggle, there's discursive. No, the discursive struggle is also material. It's distinctly material. And this is another thing which I forgot to mention earlier. When you think of an ideological state apparatus, you think of it as distinct, as I said, from the repressive state apparatus, but it's not distinct. These effects are simultaneous and connected. It's not temporarily, this happens, and then it flips and it reinforces it. The discourse of violence, which has happened, for instance, in protests with threats and so on and so forth, the freezing of assets in Canada, of the truckers who are simply trying to make a living wage, is simultaneously an ideological reproduction of an idea and a direct repressive action of violence. So we need not separate these things into such clean categories, would be one key thing I would state. The other key thing, of course, is to move away from notions of individuals and subjectivity. Like I said, the good aspect of a protest or of a mass movement is that it allows for a certain form of collectivity. But that collectivity, again, must be submitted to clear and practical goals, which are nonetheless themselves subordinated to a more universal and uniting notion, which can be agreed upon by those who are engaged in it. Now, I have other things, but I think this is a good natural place to stop. It's been how long, 15 minutes or something? Yeah, okay.
Okay. First of all, Zach, if there is somebody in the Zoom room for a question, just raise your hand. Okay, if not,
Yes, I wanted to ask you, you made an interesting point about the subjectivities. So I think I'll now explain. I think maybe it's better to move from Bardian into a Covian. So because the problem is, I think, interpretation on this and the political balance interpretation, and that's why, as you said at the beginning, we cannot go through those ideas against those ideas. I don't like capitalism, because, for example, in capitalism, if you say, like, let's say it's good that they bombarded Serbia because they did atrocity in Bosnia, then it would be like in capitalism, this would be non-PC, not politically correct, although they were like in peace. Let's say, if we generalize, they were for peace. And if we go like, and then in communism, they will say this is not good to say that statement because this is not good for Prague. And if we say like Dulan, I think is an idea, like implicitly you just can't say need in communism is coming up with the idea is great because they do like not diplomatic enough, and so I guess we should be because the Marx says everything is in interpretation. And you see, I made you this point to the point, but the echo says every interpretation should have limits. So I think we should limit the interpretation.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, there's a limited interpretation in the sense that you shouldn't give too much weight to certain ideas. You should be able to tell or reject things without having to engage them on such a deep level, which does not mean that we shouldn't engage things on a deep level. But you should also be able to say, if it looks like a horse, it is a horse, sort of thing. I mean, that's just what it is. I mean, Duke is a fascist, but we know this. We don't really need to engage in this thing. You can say he may be saying something interesting here, interesting there. But yeah, you can interpret as you wish, but there's also just what's really there.
Thank you, Zachary, for very nice presentation. You had several quite good interventions. I will only mention now that about the exploitation, which is quite important, and your reversal of a very interesting reversal of that environmental slogan, act globally, think locally, which is quite useful in our times. About how to act, which is a very important issue. Maybe especially in some when mobilization is not high in some countries or cities and so on. Maybe the concept of John Holloway of cracking capitalism, finding cracks in it and spreading them is quite useful, because we should keep in mind that capitalism is very invasive system, meaning it invades every sphere, every spore of our living, including our private lives. But it is not a concrete built system, and it has cracks, and we can find them, use them, and spread them. So it is not like if there is no mobilization, then we cannot do anything. But that is what propaganda of the ideological apparatus of the system is convincing us.
Yeah, I think I agree largely with that. Also this. Yeah, so that's what I was saying. Yeah, I agree largely with that. I think, there's also this ideological notion where it's either, especially even internal to sort of leftist thought, where it's either too little, i.e., some sort of forms are trying to get at a small crack, or it's too big and impractical, unless we shouldn't act at all. But I think, you're right. It depends sort of where those fissures and cracks are, and then how to mobilize around them. I mean, of course, even a more classic Marxist way of finding a contradiction in something and overcoming it. But no, yeah, I think fundamentally I agree with what you're saying. So
Yeah, just one sentence. It is not only on individual level. A protest is a making a country spreading. So it is a collective action also.
yeah, I would just add that when that spread needs to continue to spread, and it doesn't simply spread automatically like a normal crack in a window or your phone or something. Like you have to force the crack. And I think often with the protest, this is what happens. You make a dent, like Occupy or something. Everybody's talking about it, and then what happens? Nothing. The U.S. is just as they were. So.
Okay. So I have a question, a comment. I would like to start with a comment where you said that authoritarian takeover is happening legally. Actually, that kind of connects to the research I'm doing in terms of there are very interesting essays in terms of the judicial review process in the left, and how now at least what we see as the traditionally leftist party, the mainstream ones, are becoming increasingly more dependent on judicial review in the Anglo-Saxon sphere. However, historically, up until the 90s even, they were the political branch more skeptical of judicial review, instead insisting on more conventional, as they may term them, so democratic processes such as legislation or referenda. And what was interesting here is that it took me to the work of J.H. Griffith, who wrote in the 90s of the law as an ideological force. And what he did in his research was actually look at the way judges may be biased, but then also analyze the judges intrinsically in a sense of what class they belong to and how their background influenced the decisions they were making. That's about the comment. My main question was, in terms of the Canada protests you mentioned, are they the same as the one with the truck drivers that were blamed for not vaccinating themselves? Yeah. So I think that's no an additional comment about that. I think it was very important to address the permanent state of exception and how harmful it is to basically anyone on the political spectrum who believes in the conventional aspects of democracy. And it was definitely, I would not say interesting, but it was worrying to see how parliamentary power was eroded with the pandemic.
Yeah. No, I agree fully. Which is what I was thinking in Canada. I mean, I wasn't there when it happened. I was here, but it was a complete and utter rejection of democracy in any of its forms. And this is, again, regardless of whether your own thoughts on vaccination, it's simply anti-democracy. And we see this, of course, sort of after 9/11, which is yesterday, in the US, they initiated the Patriot Act after this, which also worked as a permanent state of exception, which has never gone away. And it's something that people always need to remember is that once these states of exception occur and the rules are changed and the rules are bent and the norms are changed, they don't revert back to how they were. They remain like that. So economically, the rich got richer. The everyday citizens had less democratic rights, and we're told all the while that it's for the greater good, for us, and so on. And as your comment about the judges, I also agree on the biases. Law is not neutral. It's simply not, nor is the implementation of law neutral. And again, sorry for using so many North American examples. I don't know the context here as well. In the US, there's tons of levels of courts, like the 9th Circuit, the 11th Circuit, and so on. So you'll have a liberal circuit judge who will say, this is completely legal, and then, or illegal, then it gets appealed, goes to a conservative court, and so on and so on and so forth. This is how things get to the Supreme Court, because they go through all these changes. And of course, the Supreme Court itself is nothing but neutral, so much so that they made it intentionally non-neutral by appointing people instead of electing them. So, yes.
Voting would be even worse.
Yeah, well,
Initial election.
Yeah, but it'll be equally as bad. At least it's oppression of your own choosing.
Okay, do we have questions? Online and offline? For the online participants, please raise hand if you have a question. Okay, if that is that, thank you, Zachary. We are continuing at 12:15 with the networking panel. Thank you.